I warmly welcome each one of you joining us for this webinar from near and far. It would have been lovely to meet face to face. Nevertheless, despite the pandemic and other grim realities that beset us, we can still connect with each other virtually through the digital platforms available. This is in keeping with Pope Francis's vision of interconnectedness, solidarity, and synodality. I take this opportunity to place on record some faculty members, and especially the JDV presidents and provincials of South Asia, who have initiated and promoted the Center for Women's Studies in JDV. The vision of the center was conceived of by the then president, Dr. Job Kolamtharam, in 2007, and supported by the South Asian provincials, Fathers Hector de Souza and Edward Mudavasari. It was then implemented by Professors George Pateri, Selva Rathinam, and the current president, Francis Gonsalves. I hope and pray that the center will serve to promote among the staff and students of JDV gender-inclusive research, critical reflection, and collaborative action on issues concerning women and gender. We look forward to connecting with other centers and individuals working for the cause of women and gender, so that together we may collaborate to create a gender-just institution, church and society that promotes the fullness of life for all. As Pope Francis rightly states in Fratelli Tutti number 8, and I quote, "We need a community that supports and helps us, in which we can help one another to keep looking ahead. Dreams are built together. Let us dream then as a single human family, as fellow travelers sharing the same flesh, as children of the same earth, which is our common home. Each of us bringing the richness of his or her beliefs and convictions. Each of us with his or her own voice, brothers and sisters all." Unquote. In this respect, I am happy to welcome two leading voices of this evening's webinar who have been promoting the cause of gender justice in their respective places. Tina Beattie, Professor Emerita of Catholic Studies at the University of Roehampton, who will deliver the inaugural lecture, and Raynah Braganza Passanha, the Chairperson of the Pune Diocese Women's Commission, who will give a short response. A good intercontinental blend. Thank you, Tina and Raynah, for gracing this occasion with your presence and your presentations. Before we listen to you, let us pause to become aware of the Spirit's presence among us, as some of the sisters doing the theology program in theology will lead us in prayer.
शांति मुझे दे दे, पावन आत्मा आजा दिल में मेरे, शांति मुझे दे दे, बरसा दे अपनी दया, बरसा दे अपनी कृपा, बरसा दे अपनी दया, बरसा दे अपनी कृपा, पावन आत्मा आजा दिल में मेरे, शांति मुझे दे दे, शांति मुझे दे दे, शांति मुझे दे दे.
Thank you, dear sisters, for melodiously leading us in prayer. I now invite the President of JDV, Professor Francis Gonsalves, to give his opening address.
Dear sisters, dear brothers, Sorelle tutte, fratelli tutti. I'm happy to be sharing a few thoughts here, though I feel a little out of place because this is supposed to be the Center for Women's Studies. My only qualification is that once I've been addressed as a feminist theologian, somebody told my sister Margaret that your brother is a feminist theologian. She didn't understand what it meant. She was not sure whether it was a compliment or an insult. So she asked me later, Francis, what does feminist theologian mean? I said, somebody who's interested about equality, gender rights, and things like that. She said, thank God, because I thought it was a feminist theologian. Friends, I stand here as Francis Bhai, as the president of JDV. I'd like to share a few thoughts for our own reflection. Two words I'd like to put before you are the following. One is flesh. Everybody who's listening to this program, who's participating, is flesh. Everybody has a heart. Participate in this program as a human being and participate with your heart, because these two words are extremely important to Pope Francis. Number 8 has already been read out by Dr. Patricia, where he speaks of the flesh. I'll read out number 2, and he says this: Francis of Assisi felt himself as a brother to the sun, the sea, and the wind, yet he knew that he was even closer to those of his own flesh. Flesh is important there because all of us share this humanity, the flesh. I will not read out number 8. Now, how would we all look at this document? Because there are men and there are women, people from all over the world, from north, south, east, and west. What is it that is common? In chapter 2, Pope Francis speaks of a stranger on the road. Who is that stranger? Think of it in terms of a woman, because we have many women on the roads today all over the world. Even before they are born, the aborted fetus, unwanted girl child not going to school, working at stalls, girls in the sex trade, girls who are raped, women selling vegetables, wife beaten and thrown out, old widows in an aged home. They are the stranger on the road. What about the Levite? Not necessarily male. It could be any woman who's not interested in what's happening, who's busy with the demands of religion, who's busy perhaps in JDV studying and not bothered what is happening about the stranger on the road. It could be a mother superior or a general in the congregation who's bothered about her own congregation, not about anybody else. What about the Good Samaritan? Not necessarily a man. It could be a woman who's very compassionate and reaches out. Friends, let us not get caught only with words. I know that the document sounds very male because of Fratelli Tutti. There are limitations of linguistics, and I would not justify and say it's all right to be always saying the number of times that woman and girl have come in the document. Woman is mentioned 21 times and sisters 28 times, but these are always coming men and women or sisters and brothers. I only want to point out 5 numbers which specifically speak of gender issues. The whole area of psychological, today number 24. Today, children and women and men of all ages are deprived of freedom and forced to live in conditions akin to slavery, where women are treated as an object. Number 27, 227, truth means recognizing the pain of women who are victims of violence and abuse. Every act of violence committed against a human being is a wound in humanity's flesh. In the whole area of the social political realm, number 23, just read out. Similarly, organization of societies worldwide is still far from reflecting clearly that women possess the same dignity and are identical rights as men. We say one thing with words, but our decisions and reality tell another story. Indeed, doubly poor are those women who endure situations of exclusion. 121, no one then can remain excluded because of his or her place of birth, much less because of privileges enjoyed by others who were born in lands of great opportunity. The limits and borders of individual states cannot stand in the way of this, as it is unacceptable that some have fewer rights by virtue of being women. And then you have in the whole question of cyberspace globality, number 24. They are skilled in using modern means of communication as a way of luring young men and women in various parts of the world, a perversion that exceeds all limits when it subjugates women and then forces them to abort with regard to trafficking. My small suggestion, and with this I will end, is for each one of you to enter into dialogue. You have two women who are going to speak, a married woman professor from UK, Tina, a married woman committed to church and society here from Pune, India, and the Jesuit Pope from the so-called global South, who's interested in poverty, who's interested in cultures, who's interested in religions. These are three concerns that most of us who are in this webinar are interested in. So I wish you all the best, that we really have a fruitful dialogue, that we listen to each other. We listen not only with our mind, but we listen with our heart. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Francis, for your challenging and inspiring words, as well as for your encouragement and support with the center. I am now happy to introduce the speaker of the day, Tina Beattie, the current director of the Catherine of Siena College, that offers a range of online courses related to theology, gender, religion, and social justice. I'm happy that you already had some time to listen to her give you some information about the college. Tina is a well-known feminist theologian who has spent much of her early life in Africa, in Zambia, Kenya, and Zimbabwe, before she and her husband Dave moved to Bristol in 1988 with their 4 children. Tina has published widely on academic and popular issues relating to theology, gender, culture, and women's rights, and she contributes regularly to the tablet, Gaudium Online, The Conversations, and other publications. Tina also has good connections with many centers for women's studies in Europe, and we now look forward to her collaboration with the JDV Centre for Women's Studies. Welcome, Tina, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, Francis and Patricia. It's really wonderful. It's a great privilege to be asked to give this talk today. And I really do want to extend congratulations and thanks to JDV for hosting this really important initiative of setting up a Centre for Women's Studies, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. My talk is about 45 minutes. There's quite a lot of ground to cover. I'm not going to read everything that's on the slides, but I've put them there so that you can follow through what I'm talking about, and I'm very happy for you all to have the slide presentation afterwards, which I've also produced as a Word document for those who want the link, and Patricia has that. So very briefly, I'm going to begin by just outlining in a very sort of a general oversight of what gender theory is, what some of the emergent theories of gender are. Then I'm going to give a brief overview of Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis's encyclical published a few months ago. And I'm going to situate that in the context of his theological vision in all 3 of his encyclicals. I'm leaving out his very first one, Lumen Fidei, which was written in collaboration with Pope Benedict. I think it's his 3 encyclicals that he's authored that give us a coherent sense of his theological vision. And finally, I'm going to just say why I think there are some problems about gender in Catholic teaching, not just in Pope Francis's theology, but ways that he himself might be perpetuating these instead of really addressing them. And I should just say in all this, I speak as someone who thanks God for Pope Francis. I think his vision for the church is inspiring in weaving together, as it does, the social vision of Vatican II, that open engagement with the world. But I feel he brings back to the vision of Vatican II the sort of mystical, sacramental dimension of the Catholic faith that was perhaps, should we say, underemphasized immediately after the council. And I would suggest it was sometimes presented in a rather problematic way in the attempt to retrieve a kind of Marian mystical dimension to the church. And I feel Pope Francis is taking us beyond that into really fertile theological ground and practical pastoral ground. And in the post-COVID world, never has the church needed the message of Christ as much as we do today. So I speak critically, I speak with parasia, to borrow Pope Francis's word, with a sort of courage to challenge. And I speak in dialogue with Pope Francis's teachings, but as a critical friend, as an honest friend who speaks out and would like to promote his vision by showing where I think women need to be more included in it. So just to begin with, I don't know about you, can you all see this? I have, I need to get rid of my...
Yes, we
There
can
are.
see. Yeah.
Okay, I just couldn't read my screen, but I've got rid of my picture now. So I want to begin by just saying how the modern Catholic Church understands the significance of gender and sexual difference. And Pope Francis says, the complementarity of man and woman, the crown of God's creation, is being questioned by so-called gender ideology in the name of a freer and more just society. The difference between man and woman is not for opposition or subordination, but it is for the sake of communion and generation, always in the image and likeness of God. Now, that concern about gender ideology is a term that's used very frequently and has been used since the emergence of gender theory in the early 1990s. Gender theory emerged out of feminism, but it's a way of enlarging the lens to say gender isn't just about women, it's about masculinities, it's about LGBTQI identities, it's about questions, very deep and often very challenging questions about how the gendered self is experienced as part of God's creation. So my first challenge would be, let's not keep talking about gender ideology as if always and everywhere it's negative. Of course it has negative sides, but if we want to criticize, we must also respect where there's goodness, where there's learning. So it's an appeal to stop talking just about gender ideology. And I hope to show you in Catholic teaching itself that actually we use gender far more than really this kind of language acknowledges. Now, the pioneer of gender theory is Judith Butler, and her theory could be called performative. She says we act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality or something that is simply true about us. But actually, it's a phenomenon that's being produced all the time. So gender is performative, says Butler. Butler's a US philosopher who's been very influential in the formation of gender theory. And that idea that gender is performative is not to say that bodies don't matter or that we don't have deep roots in our biological, physical realities, but it is to say that the gender roles we conform to are often performative insofar as they are what society puts upon us and tells us we ought to be, rather than perhaps who we really would be if we were able to be our authentic selves and find acceptance as such. Now, I'm skimming. Of course, there are questions. What is an authentic self? How do we discipline our desire? How do we form ourselves so that we are orientated towards the life of virtue and the good life? I hope that all goes without saying. Gender theory is not just saying anything goes. It's a quest in its best form to allow people to authentically ask who they are and what it means to be that person as a whole, living, contributing member of society, as someone made in God's image. So just some points that you might think about as we discuss this. What models of gender do you see when you look around in terms of behaviour and identity? These are difficult questions not to ask now, but you might like to go back and look at the presentation, reflect upon them. Do you perceive a range of sexual differences along a spectrum, or do you see people as being clearly either male or female and nothing in between? Is either of these sexes endowed with greater status, authority, or significance in your culture? And if so, why? Do you think your personal identity, your position in society and or in your domestic environment have been affected in positive or negative ways by gender? So those are just some of the ways in which I would suggest we personalize gender theory and try to make sense of it in our own existential contexts and experiences. And just very briefly to explain the different terminology that's used in gender theory, the word sex normally refers to biological chromosomal characteristics of the physical body, the biological body, and that would include male, female, or intersex. The word gender normally refers to cultural and linguistic concepts of sexual difference or sexual identity, and might include masculinity, femininity, cisgender, which is the term used to describe people who identify as heterosexual in conformity with their biological sex, and transgender, which is people who experience an identity that's more complex or fluid or other than the physical body that they are, male or female. And sexuality refers to relationships of desire and difference, and it can of course refer to anything heterosexual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, celibate. They're all to do with sexuality. And I would just say that what sometimes happens is when people talk about gender ideology, I think deep down sometimes there's a fear that this is about promiscuity, it's about sexual libertarianism. But you know, all our relationships are gendered, and we have lots of gendered relationships that are not sexual. Think about families, parents, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles. Those are all gendered relationships, but they're not sexual relationships. So we have to just be a bit careful when we use these terms to be a little clear about what we're referring to. Now, I could go on at great length here, but I want to go on to, sorry, there's one more slide before I go on to the main focus for today. And that's just to point out that we can break down attitudes to gender and sex into roughly 3 ways of looking at it. Essentialist would say there are 2 and only 2 sexes created by God, affirmed by natural law, and they're not only about biological differences, but about psychological characteristics, orientations, aptitudes for certain roles in society. Constructivist would say we have concepts of femininity and masculinity which are to a large extent shaped by our societies, and we grow up learning to conform to these in accordance with our given sex. And performative, as I've said, would be Judith Butler. That's a more oppressive understanding of sexual difference as maintaining social patriarchal hierarchies, so that difference is not really about difference, but about hierarchy, positive, negative, subordinate, authoritative, etc. Again, I don't want to go into all that now. It's a hugely complex issue. I want to move on to Fratelli Tutti. And as we all know, this encyclical is inspired by St. Francis of Assisi. It takes its title from an address to his brothers by Francis of Assisi. And its opening paragraph speaks of a way of life exhorted by Francis that's marked by the flavour of the gospel. I think that's a lovely expression, actually. It speaks of a love that transcends the barriers of geography and distance, and of a fraternal openness that allows us to acknowledge, appreciate, and love each person, regardless of physical proximity, regardless of where he or she was born or lives. And I think all this vision, which, as I say, so far is taken directly really from St. Francis, has to be understood in the context of Pope Francis's concern for a world that's becoming increasingly fragmented, increasingly divided by wealth, by nationalism, by race, by various ideologies which set us against each other, which fragment the cohesion of the human family, and which increase the obscene wealth of some individuals, nations, and corporations, while depriving the poor of the basic necessities of survival. And he started, these were all concerns before COVID. He started drafting this before COVID, and it's very much in keeping with his other encyclicals. But of course, thinking of a post-COVID world, when, please God, it arrives, lends a new urgency and a new depth to these very rich reflections in Fratelli Tutti. And I've just identified some of the key themes in the encyclical. It's about fraternity and social friendship. It uses the parable of the Good Samaritan to speak about those who go outside the closed borders of their own worlds, and particularly who see and respond to the cry of the suffering, as the Good Samaritan did, outside his own national, tribal, religious affiliations. And it calls us to build bridges of love and solidarity. An open world, so as we live in a world of increasingly closed borders, refugees, the terrible plight of people who are forced into unbearable situations by this closing down of our borders, both psychological, social, and real. And a respect for the principle of the universal destination of goods. God's good creation is intended for the flourishing of each and the flourishing of all. Respect for people's freedoms, the right to travel, to seek a better life, to have protection and to enjoy religious freedom. A change in politics so that we give central importance to protecting people's fundamental human rights and to the promotion of solidarity and subsidiarity among nations and peoples. And all this needs kindness, dialogue, and friendship. I think one of the most significant features of Fratelli Tutti is its rejection of war and the death penalty. Now, the church has been moving in this direction for some time, really, for probably about 30 or 40 years. The teaching has been solidifying around these issues, so that a pro-life ethos is coming to mean respect for human life in all its stages, shapes, and forms, and must include condemnation of war and the death penalty, and not just abortion. And again, I think we see here a subtle rebuke to the direction that the US church has gone in, particularly in being a very militarized culture, a culture with, as we know, very liberal gun laws and the terrible deaths that go with that, but being a culture where Catholics seem to be obsessed, and that was one of Pope Francis's words early on, obsessed only with abortion and issues of sexuality. So it's a call to really recover that sense of the seamless garment of the dignity of life, particularly the most vulnerable. And also he emphasizes the importance of interreligious dialogue. His encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si, was written in dialogue with Patriarch Bartholomew, among others. And Patriarch Bartholomew, as you will know, is a leader of the Orthodox Church. And in Fratelli Tutti, we have a dialogue with leaders of Islam, calling on the dialogue that I can't remember the date, I think it was December 2016, but when religious leaders met, maybe it was 2018, and signed a document of interreligious collaboration. In all this, Pope Francis is in a way standing up to his critics and his enemies, and he does have enemies. He has people who want to put us into a very rigid box of doctrine and authoritarianism, and Pope Francis wants to open this up to a conversation with the world about how we can transform the future for future generations and for all God's creation. So with that in mind, I read Fratelli Tutti in conjunction with his other two encyclicals, and I see this as the development of a whole theology. We always learn a lot about papal encyclicals when we look at who they're addressed to, and only one of Pope Francis's three encyclicals has an addressee in the title. Evangelii Gaudium from 2013 is addressed to the bishops, clergy, consecrated persons, and the lay faithful. In other words, this first sole-authored Encyclical is about the church, it's about ecclesiology, and it's written for the people of the church. And as we all know, it is a resounding condemnation of clericalism, of dogmatic absolutism, of rigid rules that forget the vulnerability and fragility and failure often of the human condition, and seem to expect people simply to conform unquestioningly to very rigid doctrines and rules imposed by a clerical class remote from and out of touch with the reality of the people they minister to. Laudato Si, on Care for Our Common Home, doesn't have an addressee in the title, but Pope Francis makes very clear that this is an invitation to dialogue for everyone on the planet about creation and the environment and how we address the urgency of the environmental crisis. And then Fratelli Tutti is a focus again for all humankind, not this time on the environment, but on, we might say, on society, on the social good, which he calls fraternity. So the church, the environment and society, I see this as a very coherent theological project. And I would imagine that Pope Francis sees it as the totality of his official teaching, although who knows, there might yet be more encyclicals to come. Now, there are 4 guiding principles that Pope Francis uses throughout all his theology and in many of his more informal, off-the-cuff interviews and conversations. Time is greater than space. These are all from Evangelii Gaudium. His concern here is that the politics and values of our time are consumerist in every aspect. Everything has to happen now. Everything is short term. Everything is crammed into the present in a way that doesn't allow time for the organic unfolding of life, for mistakes to be made and rectified, for growth to happen. So Pope Francis sees that we need to learn to allow time for the unfolding of visions and ideas. We need patience and discernment, those great Jesuit characteristics of the life of faith. Unity prevails over conflict. But when he says this, he doesn't mean the kind of unity that refuses to acknowledge conflict. He means a much deeper process of working through differences, even very painful differences, and being willing to allow our struggles and issues to emerge, to face up to them and deal with them, and to move beyond that to what he calls a reconciled unity, to a harmony that emerges from struggle and from the conflicts that are part of any meaningful and real relationship. Realities are more important than ideas. So again, this is part of his critique of an approach to doctrine that would deal rather in absolutes than in pastoral realities. And he gets this, I think, from liberation theology. We all remember the lessons of the liberation theologians of the 1980s, orthopraxy before orthodoxy. I think that in a way is what he's saying. Our practice has to actually come before our conformity to ideas. Now, he's not changing doctrine. I don't think there are any significant doctrines that Francis has changed. He's allowed for the development of some of them, like teaching on war and the death penalty, for example. But I think more than that, he is softening the contours of doctrine so that it can be incorporated into human life and flow with us as we live and love and learn and fall and rise again. So doctrine isn't the cage we inhabit, but it's rather the skin that grows with us and shapes us even as we shape it through the way we live it. And the whole is greater than the part. And here again, what he wants is to find a balance between the importance of the particular and the individual, whether it's the individual person or culture or context, and the unity of the whole. So these are all quite related, and they're guiding themes in everything he writes and says. And I think it's helpful to bear that in mind. Another absolutely central theme to Pope Francis is the importance of dialogue. And in Amoris Laetitia, in his post-apostolic exhortation on the family, he gives a wonderful guide for dialogue. It's intended for dialogue between married couples, but I think it could apply to any situation in which human beings have struggled to understand and love one another in the midst of struggles and differences. And it's this that I'm actually wanting to take forward into my dialogue with Pope Francis about the role of women in his thought and the ways in which gender functions in his rich theological vision. And the other thing that I want to bear in mind with this is his emphasis on the incarnational, historical, enculturated dimension of the gospel message. And again, we're very much back in Vatican II territory here. And if we remember perhaps in the sort of papacies of Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, there was a tendency to shift a little more to a sort of trans-historical, transcendent understanding of the church, maybe over and above the world rather than within and muddling along in the world. And I think Pope Francis, of course, as an Argentinian, a Latin American Pope, is very aware of cultural differences. And he says the people of God is incarnate in the peoples of the earth, each of which has its own culture, and we reflect the gospel in different ways. We reflect the God of history in different ways. Elsewhere, he speaks about the God of history is walking with us. And turning to talk about women, my questions really are, is it true that realities are always greater than ideas? We'll see. And does Pope Francis recognize with sufficient insight and depth that womanhood, motherhood, femininity, these things are all also cultural, contextual, and change over times and places? They're not solid ideas into which everything else fits. And my fear is that when he talks about women as mothers, women as feminine genius, sometimes he forgets the wisdom of his own insights about realities being greater than ideas, about practice being the ways in which doctrine is made supple and gentle and nuanced to be incarnate in life as it is, and about the ways in which cultural diversity affects our understanding of who we are in terms of gender and everything else. Now, with all that in mind, let me move on to look at how Pope Francis discusses women and mothers. In Evangelii Gaudium, that first encyclical, which is about the church and those of us who are within the church, he acknowledges the contribution that women make to society and emphasizes feminine qualities of sensitivity, intuition, and the skill sets that women possess more than men. That women show a special concern to others, which finds particular expression in motherhood. And he acknowledges that women do share pastoral responsibilities with priests, and that we need to create more opportunities for a more incisive female presence in the church. And then he uses that term which some of us really dread, the feminine genius is needed in all expressions in the life of society, both in the church and in social structures. Now, this is where feminists like me begin to get a bit uncomfortable. First of all, I've yet to meet a woman who can really tell me what feminine genius is. I mean, yeah, we do lots of things that women do. We bring up children, we run households, we cook meals, but, you know, we can also be as tyrannical and abusive as men when we get into positions of power. There's no particular gift about feminine genius that makes us automatically nice. Women have different ways of exercising abusive power, but you know, we're just as entitled to original sin as we are to original blessing, and we tend to make just as good use of it. So there's a kind of romanticism here about feminine genius, and we need to be able to put that idea aside and talk about the reality of women's lives, that we too are muddling along, that we are shaped by our cultures, that we're different. And if there is such a thing as feminine genius, it's not particular to women. If what we mean by feminine genius is sensitivity, intuition, maternal ability to care, I would dare to suggest that one of the best examples of that today is Pope Francis himself. And I know some women who don't have those qualities. So we need to get real about women and our role in society and the church if we are to make the kind of contribution that we must make if we are to be a church that reflects the face of Christ incarnate to the world. Now, this is where I'm a little bit mischievous here, but I'm showing you that what I'm saying is plausible. I spoke earlier about gender and sex, and I mentioned that gender ideology is seen in a very negative light by Pope Francis as well as his predecessors. But I love this little section from Evangelii Gaudium. The church is a mother, and she preaches in the same way that a mother speaks to her child. The spirit of love which reigns in a family guides both mother and child in their conversations. Therein they teach and learn, experience correction, and grow in appreciation of what is good. Something similar happens in a homily. Now, let's think about this for a minute. So, when a priest gives a homily, he's like a mother with her child. But women are not allowed to give the homily during Mass. So we have a bit of a gender problem here, I think. On the one hand, this is gender, not sex. The body that gives a motherly homily is a male body, and a female body isn't allowed to do it. And there's a question here of, I don't want to say just justice, because sacramental representation isn't first and foremost about equality. It's about a justice that's to do with our capacity to bear the person of Christ and to know that if what was not assumed was not redeemed, we women were assumed in the flesh of Christ, and therefore we are surely as much in persona Christi as men. So there's a point I want to make. What does it mean to say sexual difference is absolute, God made male and female and nothing in between, and gender ideology is wrong? And then to say, but women can't be priests and priests are mothers when they preach the homily. I find all this gets a little worrying, confusing. In Laudato Si, it is a gendered encyclical through and through, even though sadly it says nothing about the ways in which environmental degradation impact particularly upon the lives of the world's poorest women. Nowhere in any Catholic social teaching is there an attempt to discuss what it means to recognize that nearly 300,000 women die every single year in causes relating to childbirth and pregnancy, and 99% of those, as you will know in India, are in the world's poorest societies. I think it's something like 65% are in sub-Saharan Africa and 30-something% are in Southeast Asia. And yet here in Laudato Si, we do see the cries of the mother in childbirth being acknowledged, but it's Mother Earth. The sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. Now, the three things I would say if Pope Francis were sitting, maybe he's joined us on YouTube. I hope so. That would be wonderful. But Pope Francis, if you're listening, just to say, first of all, we need to hear women who groan in travail, women who groan in childbirth. But secondly, we need to see that Mother Earth, like ordinary women, is not just this romantic, tender, maternal presence. Mother Earth, like ordinary women, can be driven to desperation so much that she may even abort her children. What is COVID if not Mother Earth crying out to us, enough, you are destroying me and all the life I protect, and some of you are going to have to go. Now that sounds very harsh and brutal, but the point I'm trying to make, perhaps in an exaggerated way, is that when we violate Mother Earth, when we destroy the resources upon which we depend to live, to flourish, Mother Earth fights back, because God's creation is greater than us. And that closing part of the book of Job, where God doesn't come and explain Job's suffering, God just says, look how small you are, look at the mystery and majesty of creation and see your place within it. So I'm concerned that the romanticization of maternal life, whether in the lives of women or in the life of creation of the earth, risks us not really having the capacity to address the problems. And my third point would be related to that. It's not enough just to treat women and maternal figures as victims. We are not helpless, waiting to be rescued by men. We are co-workers with Christ. We are his disciples, co-equal with you in the work he calls us to do. We don't sit in a ditch waiting to be rescued just because we're women. We want to get into the ditch with you and rescue all the men and women and children, born and unborn, every human being who is down there in the ditch, crying out for help. And to paint women only as victims, to paint women always as feminine genius who offer something to this church that's essentially run by men, isn't going to allow us to do the work that we urgently need to do together to care for the body of Christ in creation and in the lives of the world's poorest people and in all the creatures threatened by extinction and destruction by our way of life. So I'm absolutely with you, Pope Francis, in your vision, but you must see us as your equals and not as among the people who are kind of romanticized in the background, either victims or a soft feminine presence that doesn't seem to do very much. And here in Fratelli Tutti, we get an acknowledgement that the Organization of Societies Worldwide is still far from reflecting clearly that women possess the same dignity and identical rights to men. We say one thing with words, but our decisions and reality tell another story. Oh dear. Indeed, doubly poor are those women who endure situations of exclusion, mistreatment and violence, since they are frequently less able to defend their rights. But that's as true within the Church as it is within any other society. It's as true within the Vatican State as it is within any other state. To exclude women, to silence women, to fail to involve women fully in the project of being human is actually to violate something very fundamental about the human person. And here are the ways in which I think Fratelli Tutti betrays Pope Francis's beautiful vision. The choice of title, Brothers All. Now, if Pope Francis learned from his own wisdom about the importance of enculturation, the wisdom of culture, he would see that It's fine to say this is a quotation from Francis of Assisi, but he chose to use that quotation as the title of the document. And in terms of the cultural awareness of most, not most maybe, but many, many women around the world, including some of the most active women in the church, we are not brothers all. And some people said, oh, well, it's a problem of translation. In Italian, Fratelli Tutti is inclusive. And quite a few Italian women have come forward and said, no, we don't want to be fratelli either. We're sorelle, we're sisters. So there is a problem with the title of the document and the underlying theme of fraternity. Now, I wouldn't labour that too much, but fraternity does mean brotherhood. And the problem is when we look at the church's leadership, we do indeed see a brotherhood from which women are excluded. And how can the church model a version of inclusive fraternity to the world if what the world sees when it looks at us is women always kept from positions of authority? Now, it's sometimes said to me, but women have more and more roles in administration in the church, and Pope Francis is committed to promoting women to those roles. Well, come on, guys, if I want a job in administration, there are lots of big businesses that would offer me a career break. And I'm not in the church to be an administrator. I'm in the church because I'm a sacramental member of the body of Christ, not because I want to be in an admin job. So admin jobs are fine. We've all done them. But really, is that where women belong in the church as administrators? The thing that concerns me more than either of these linguistic things, though, is the lack of any evidence of dialogue with women in Fratelli Tutti. There are 288 footnotes, not a single woman is cited. Now, there are probably as many women Catholic theologians as male Catholic theologians in the world today. Some faculties of theology have more women than men in them. There are philosophers and ecofeminists and biblical scholars and theologians who have been on message with Pope Francis since the 1980s and before, since the 1970s. And my regret is that these wouldn't challenge his vision, but would root it, would make it real rather than ideas. It would enable women to feel invited to be full participants in making this happen. Pope Francis recently commented that women leaders, I think it's in the new book that has just been published, which was through a series of interviews with Austin Ivory, where he acknowledges that women have been great leaders during COVID, but nowhere in Fratelli Tutti does he mention any of that, or indeed any significant roles for women at all. A reader who came across this encyclical in 500 years' time might conclude that there were no women in any significant positions in the church. And yes, Professor Francis mentioned that the language mentions women many times. And I think maybe, one of the good things about Pope Francis is that his encyclicals do use inclusive language. Certainly the English translations always have brothers and sisters, men and women. But there's not much point in using inclusive language if that idea isn't shown in reality of what women do, how women live, what gifts we bring. Why does it matter? Now, I've just finished reviewing Kochirani Abraham's wonderful book, Persisting Patriarchy, for the Asian Journal of Theology. And here's some of what Kochirani says, which I think tells us why these things matter. She was motivated to do her research and write her book by the question, why do Kerala women, highly educated though they are, subscribe to an ideology that invests women with an inferior status? So reading this book, I gained so many insights relevant not just to Kerala culture, but to women's cultures worldwide. Why? And I say this as a woman living in Britain who looks at the way many of the women around me live. High-flying achievers, professional women, women with educations, women with economic well-being, who still somehow become the servants when they go into the house. And Kochirani's point is that women in Kerala, despite having every kind of economic and educational advantage and equality in secular society, still conform to a very patriarchal system when they go back into the family home. And the way in which these gendered hierarchies work is that they are naturalized. We are conditioned to see them as normal, as God-given, as scriptural. That is gender ideology. Let me say that is what gender ideology does. It brainwashes us into thinking that what is what must be. And, says Kochirani, it's not surprising that both CSC, Christian women in the Syrian Catholic community, women and men endorse male superiority in gender relations. And why is this a problem? Because women who are religious tend to assimilate and observe dogmatically the gendered prescriptions of religious traditions, beliefs and practices in an uncritical manner without being conscious of its detrimental effects on their growth as persons. And Kochirani has some case studies which make truly heartbreaking reading. The one that sticks in my mind is the young mother with 3 children. Her twins were only a few months old when she hanged herself from the cradle rope of one of the twins' cradles because she could no longer bear the extreme demands that her husband's family were putting upon her. Now, I want that kind of story of maternal life to inform what popes mean when they talk about feminine genius and motherhood. I want them to listen to those stories and to see that without working with women themselves, they will never be able to transform that world, and to ignore it, to write it out of the story because it's too difficult to deal with, isn't what I expect of Pope Francis. I think he's shown us he can do better. So we need to take seriously these realities if we want to be a poor church of the poor. If we want to be a church that smells of the sheep, we must also be a church that smells of the obstetric and gynae ward in a poor hospital. If we want to be a church that's a field hospital that gets down into the ditch, we need to get down into the ditch of women's bodies and the suffering and the crying out for justice that emanate from those bodies in all their many cultures and contexts and struggles and visions and hopes. So I come back to that quotation from Fratelli Tutti, and you will all recognize, I think, where the image in this slide comes from. But I think it's still true of the church when one reads the beautiful things that documents might say about feminine genius and motherhood, that they're saying one thing with their words, but their decisions and reality tell another story. So here we are. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tina, for your thought-provoking and challenging insights on Fratelli Tutti, and for showing us its relation with the other encyclicals of Pope Francis. Thank you especially for putting before us a clear understanding of gender in contrast to sex and sexuality, and showing us a way to dialogue with this encyclical. But I will now allow Raynah Braganza to give her thoughts and impressions on your presentation. Raynah is a familiar face in Pune and Mumbai and is very much connected to JDV, being a member of the internal grievance cell. She is an educationist, a trainer in catechesis, and the understanding of faith and gender-related issues for religious men and women, seminarians, and lay faithful groups, especially teachers. She is also very much a seeker who continues to be involved academically in studying the faith and its application to reality. Over to you, Raynah.
Thank you, Patricia, and the Center for Women's Studies. It is an honor to be able to speak, especially but it is also daunting because I'm responding to my professor. I've done several courses with the Catherine of Siena, and I've also done courses under Tina. Thank you, team, for this comprehensive presentation of Pope Francis's latest gift to the Church and the world. You began by highlighting how the link between the document and the counsels of Saint Francis, in which the saint calls for a love that transcends barriers of geography and distance. You highlighted the development of Francis's theology through his different encyclicals and exhortations, Evangelii Gaudium, Laudato Si, Amoris Laetitia, Fratelli Tutti. You highlighted for us his concern has been to address the fractured world we live in, which is getting increasingly fragmented by issues of nationalism, of wealth, religion, etc. Your reflections showed us how his train of thought in his encyclicals has always been towards building unity, actively responding to present current realities, and doing it not through mere ideas, but through dialogue, encounters, and action, be it within families, with states, society, or people of other faiths. He is all towards promoting human development and achieving common good of all. You also drew our attention to the fact that his writings, and Francis also did that right at our Francis Gonsalves also did that at the beginning, where he spoke of Pope Francis's regard for women and how he acknowledges their contribution to society and the church through what he calls their sensitivity, intuition, and other distinctive skill sets. It is evident in the document that he is concerned about the situation of women and the need to create still broader opportunities for a more incisive female presence in the church, where he talks of the presence of women needing to be guaranteed in the settings where important decisions are made, both in the church and in social structures. Like you said, his words sadly are not reflected in concrete action. While highlighting feminine genius and highlighting things, words that sound good, somehow or the other, the spaces that he talks about creating are very slow to come in the church at all levels, local, national, universal. You then went on and spelled out the themes which in Fratelli Tutti, which synthesize much of his social magisterium and his aim to draw people of goodwill into a conversation about the practical moral obligations within the one human family, which he keeps emphasizing. Some of the themes that you spelled out were the call to fraternity and social friendship. I like the fact that you spoke about how we talk about fraternity, the unity of fraternal solidarity, and yet the church in its witness does not show inclusive fraternal solidarity. You spoke about the parable of the Good Samaritan, where he calls us to be neighbors to each other, not bystanders, or even supporters of exploiters, manipulators by our walls of apathy and indifference. He calls us to overcome prejudices and barriers and build bridges of love and solidarity with the suffering instead. He speaks of an open world in which people's dignity is respected He talks about respect for people's rights to travel, to seek a better life, to have protection, religious freedom. He talks about the need for a politics that gives central importance to protecting fundamental rights of people. And he talks about kindness, dialogue, and friendship, where we choose to work to regain the inherent dignity of all by being welcoming, promoting, protecting each other's rights, especially those who are being increasingly marginalized as the other. You spoke about his pro-life ethos, which reaches out to all states and forms of life, which is seen in his clear stand again in the rejection of war and the death penalty. We know that his emphasis on interreligious dialogue is not just words. The document that he signed with the Imam shows us his readiness for collaboration. You then began to draw attention on how Fratelli Tutti violates the wonderful insights and principles in its approach to gender. Right from the title, which addresses brothers all and the theme of fraternity, with its implicit suggestion of brotherhood, language which is exclusive was retained, despite women expressing their reservations about it before the release of the document. And in spite of, as you said, the growing rejection of exclusive language by women across the world. Instead of reconsidering the title, attempts were made to mansplain it to women that they need to see themselves included in the term brothers. Again, the onus is put on women. No doubt Pope Francis, I love the guy. I stay on in the church because he gives me hope. No doubt he intends to be inclusive. But once again, as Paolo Lazzarini, the president of the Italian group Women for the Church, pointed out, once again we have been told by the Vatican how we must interpret its words. If we can or cannot feel offended, and even that our requests are absurd. For us in India, sadly, this exclusive language is not so much of an issue. 2 days ago, I was sternly reprimanded by a religious sister at a webinar on Fratelli Tutti for saying that Fratelli does not include women. And on the chat, she very strongly tried to correct me. If we raise the issue of language needing to be inclusive, we are condemned for making a hoo-ha about nothing. In fact, in India, like in that webinar, we constantly hear priests, bishops talking about men, mankind, etc., etc. We somehow fail in India to understand the impact on fostering mindsets that language has. Mindsets that accept discrimination, accept exclusion, and the diminishing of the dignity of women in all aspects of life. You spoke how, despite his repeated emphasis on dialogue, there is an absence of dialogue with women theologians, biblical scholars. Women are not represented in his footnotes, nor their significant role in global leadership and achievement drawn attention to, nor is there a mention of women who inspire his theological reflection. Fratelli Tutti, in fact, talks about 3 men that inspire him. Do these omissions matter when the document is filled, as Francis says, with gems of wisdom, immense inspiration, immense wisdom that is of tremendous importance for the world at this time. You quote our own theologian, Kochurani, from her book, Persisting Patriarchies, where she speaks of how women's consciousness of their dignity and place in the hierarchy of relations is shaped by their assimilation of messages from the dogmatic, gendered prescriptions of religious traditions, beliefs, and practices. This all happens so subtly and has a detrimental effect on women's growth as persons, fully human, fully in the image of Christ. As you drew attention to the para 23 twice, it really is a mirror for the church and those in the seats of power, as well as those sitting in the pews, to recognize the cognitive dissonance between what we say and what we do in the church. Thus, making our reality within the church itself far from reflecting clearly that women possess the same dignity and identical rights as men. We say one thing with words, but our decisions and reality tell another story indeed. Pope Francis's words and some actions reveal that his intent is not to exclude women. Maybe he needs advisors, editors, translators, or as you call them, critical friends who will give him honest feedback. About the link between exclusion in language to mindsets which accept diminishing the other. For a Pope who acknowledges and embraces in his ambit all whom good Catholics consider the other, people of other faiths, LGBTQI people, migrants, etc. If he could change to embracing the term people of goodwill, he will surely be open to his language being inclusive with respect to gender. To end, I would like to quote Phyllis Zagano, a researcher and writer, who writes questions in an NCR article. What exactly does it mean to include women in the church? What does it mean for women to be present? What does it mean even for women to be acknowledged as half of the human race? She says it's a man's world, no doubt, when you think of it. Fratelli Tutti is written by a man, Francis, who took the title from a man, St. Francis of Assisi, who was speaking to men, his friars. And now this document is addressed to men. While Francis does not mean to insult women or other genders, writing that is published under his name too often misses the mark and is needlessly offensive. Like so much that is tumbling from the Vatican printing presses, this wonderful document and so many others do not benefit from the presence of women at the table. As a result, Fratelli Tutti shares practical wisdom, but lacks the insights of women, which a sharper gender lens could provide. Without engaging with women as equal partners and change agents in dialogue and decision-making, the church loses out sadly on a tremendous force that would enable the rich papal social teachings to bear fruit. Instead, women's agency is essentialized, romanticized, politically subordinated, and entirely neglected. Together, let us dream of the day when our church, the one we are part of, the one we love so much and desire to make more representative of God's kingdom, let us dream that this church one day, inshallah, one day soon, will be prepared to do a self-examination. Fratelli Tutti can provide the yardstick to see the areas we need to challenge, change, heal, so that we may grow to be all that we can be, men and women, in the image and likeness of God. Thank you.
I am Sister Fabian Jose. I'm one of the faculty member in JDV Pune. So, good evening, carissime sorelle e fratelli tutti. First of all, I thank the Almighty God for bringing all of us together during this pandemic COVID-19 to reflect on understanding gender in relation to Fratelli Tutti, the recent document of the Church promulgated by Pope Francis. I acknowledge with gratitude the main speaker of this event, respected Professor Emerita Tina Beattie, for accepting our invitation and making us to understand the deeper meaning of Fratelli Tutti in the light of gender relation. You have spoken with courage, clarity, and vision. You have highlighted some of the important themes in the document: to be a good Samaritan, to listen to the cry of the poor, the need for kindness, dialogue, and friendship in the society, and above all, emphasizing the gender relations in the document Fratelli Tutti as well as in the other documents. You have pointed out the document failed to recognize the role of women as leaders and transformers. And it is an invitation you are offering to each one of us through Fratelli Tutti to enter into dialogue and build a better world, church, and the society by respecting the dignity of everyone in all spheres of life. And may God continue to bless you, dear Professor Tina Beattie, for your availability and spending your precious time. And may God continue to bless your mission too. Okay. Thanks to Mrs. Raynah Braganza for responding to the speaker with the confidence and conviction. And you have summarized so beautifully the presentation of Professor Tina Beattie so meaningfully and significantly, making us to understand the deeper meaning. We are also indebted to the president of JDV, Professor Francis Gonsalves SJ, for your opening address, which invites us to enter into dialogue with everyone and culture. And also, thanks to you, Professor Francis Gonsalves, for encouraging the women to make a difference in the world, the church, and in the society. Thanks to Dr. Patricia Santos Arjame for introducing the speaker and moderating the sessions. And above all, organizing today's entire webinar as the animator of the JDV Women's Forum. We owe our gratitude to Dr. Dinesh Braganza and Dr. Shiju for your generous help in rendering your service technically for the success of the webinar. Thanks to JDV diploma students for the melodious prayer song, which led us to experience the presence of divine. I am thankful to all the faculty members and students of JDV for your constant support and help for empowering women in the campus. We are also indebted to all the participants of this webinar for your interest and active participation, which made a difference in the effectiveness of the webinar. Once again, thanks to one and all. May God bless you all till we meet.